Hello and welcome to Searching the Sacred. We are just delighted to be in the midst of these conversations that we are having this season. It's a little different than the regular seasons we've done on Searching the Sacred, where we, with the help of Rachel, who's been on each of the episodes, had this recognition of 10 women that existed across different religious traditions and had a desire to talk about that and to talk about those women and to learn about them from one another and from our traditions and to wrestle and wonder and question and expand together. So today we are talking about the story of Lot's wife. And as we have been doing, we are going to start with a reading from 3 different sacred texts. And then we are going to go back around and introduce the people who did the reading and who are part of the conversation today. So Rabbi Tamar, would you start us off, please?
Sure. So I'm reading a few verses from Genesis. In Hebrew, we call it Bereshit, chapter 19. And I'll be skipping a couple verses in between. וכמו השחר עלה, ויעיצו המלאכים בלוט, לאמור קום, קח את אשתך ואת 2 בנותיך הנמצאות, פן תיספר באבון העיר. ויחזיקו הנשים בידו וביד אשתו וביד 2 בנותיו בחמלת אדוני עליו ויוציאוהו ויניחוהו מחוץ לעיר. As dawn broke, the messengers urged Lot on, saying, Up, take your wife and your 2 remaining daughters, lest you be swept away because of the iniquity of the city. Still he delayed. So the agents seized his hand and the hands of his wife and his 2 daughters, in Adonai's mercy on him, and brought him out and left him outside the city. When they had brought them outside, one said, Flee for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, lest you be swept away. I'll skip ahead a little bit. Adonai rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah sulfurous fire from Adonai out of heaven, annihilating those cities and the entire plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and the vegetation of the ground. Lot's wife looked back, and she thereupon turned into a pillar of salt.
Thank you. Rachel.
I'm going to be reading from Luke chapter 17, verses 29 through 33. And these are the words of Jesus. But on the day Lot left Sodom, fire and sulfur rained down from heaven and destroyed them all. That's the way it will be on the day the human one is revealed. On that day, those on the roof whose possessions are in the house shouldn't come down to grab them. Likewise, those in the field should not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever tries to preserve their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life will preserve it.
Thank you. Mariam.
Yeah, and I will say it in English, but I will share with you the verse in the Quran that talks about it. And so there are verses. It's the surah's name is called Hud, and the verses it's 1177 till 80. So I will say it in English. When our messenger angels came to Lut, he was distressed and worried by their arrival. He said, "This is a terrible day," and his people, who were used to shameful deeds, came to him rushing. He pleaded, "Oh, my people, here are my daughters for marriage. They're pure for you. So fear Allah," which means fear God, "and do not humiliate me by disrespecting my guests. Is there not a single right-minded man among you?" They argued, "You certainly know that we have no need for your daughters. You already know what we desire." He responded, "If only I had the strength to resist you or to rely on a string supporter. However, it's important to note that here that although Lut's wife was a believer, or a disbeliever, and sided with the people of Sodom, she did not engage in those homosexual practices herself, mentioning her betrayal, the verses in the Quran.
Thank you, Mariam. Well, we are going to go around and introduce ourselves, but maybe it's always good to start with a couple of reminders for ourselves and for our audience. First, that we are representing ourselves. There is no way that one person represents the entirety of a faith tradition. So there are going to be disagreements between what we might say and what someone else from our tradition might say, and that's okay. We get to be human and express our opinions and wrestle and wonder and learn together. I also want to name that it can be difficult to talk about a passage like this, that I think in each of the traditions there's some fraught things here about how this divine presence is acting in maybe retribution or judgment or violence, and in the way humans are interacting with that as well. And so that can just feel like a sensitive conversation to have. So we will do our best to hold that conversation sensitively for those who have been victims of unjust acts and oppression and violence themselves, and see what we can glean from this conversation about Lot's wife today. So in the same order, we are going to go back around. I'm going to invite you to please share your name, what faith tradition you come from, and if you have a role or a way that an expanded way you describe that tradition for yourself. And then also what, if anything, you grew up hearing or learning about this character of Lot's wife. And then we will expand that into how we think about her today. But let's start with how that began for us. So Rabbi Tamar.
So my name is Tamar McGill Grimm, and I'm the senior rabbi at Beth Jacob Congregation in Mendota Heights, Minnesota. I received my rabbinic ordination from the Hebrew College Rabbinical School in Boston. I guess the thing I'll add that I guess I haven't said this in some of the other episodes we recorded, but the synagogue that I serve is affiliated with the conservative movement. And so that means that we view Jewish law as binding, but as something that can change over time. There's more to it, but that's sort of a quick summary of it. My initial encounter with this story and with the story of Lot's wife, I think, when you learn these stories as a child, you learn them differently for sure than you would as an adult, but like this one in particular. I think my memory of it is being just sort of incredulous at the whole idea that a person could turn to a pillar of salt, and sort of like, what is this about? And obviously it's supposed to be a metaphor, but kind of the like idea of, well, wow, doing the wrong thing, after you've been told, like, don't look at this, could have like such a horrible impact. I mean, it's pretty upsetting and disturbing to encounter this story as a young person, and as I've gotten older, I guess I would say, and learned the story more in depth, it's gotten more disturbing, but for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk more about that.
Thank you.
My name is Rachel Pye Jones, and I am a Christian. And my interest in these kinds of conversations is really stemming from my 20 years of living abroad in the Horn of Africa, in Djibouti, and in Somaliland, where I was immersed in a Muslim majority context and started to be exposed to the idea that some of these characters show up in the Quran with some similarities and some differences, and that just fascinated me. And Lot's wife was one in particular that caught my attention. I could say that about every woman that we've talked about so far, but because her story in Genesis, she exists only in one particular verse. Her family is in more than one verse, but she's in one verse, and then Jesus talks about her. That just feels weird. As a child, I never heard anything except that the lesson of Lot's wife was, don't disobey. Do what you're supposed to do, and if you don't, you will be potentially violently punished. My other kind of personal story about Lot's wife that I think is just fun is that I was such a Christian Bible nerd as a kid that I think it was in 5th grade for Halloween. We trick-or-treated in our neighborhood, but we also had like a Halloween party at church. And so we were supposed to dress up as Bible characters. And so I went as Lot's wife. And people didn't know what I was. I was in white, kind of like a ghost, but with a little cap on. And I thought that was pretty cool. That was my best Halloween costume ever.
I don't think I knew that story, Rachel, that you dressed as a pillar of salt.
Is there a picture? Does there exist? Oh,
I could ask my mom. There might be. I don't know. There might be.
I think it's worth a look.
Miriam, can we hear a little bit more about you?
Yeah, my name is Mariam Mohamed. I'm Muslim, and I grew up as Muslim. And my culture, when I was growing up, my family traced to really were faithful to Islam. And so my culture as a young girl, hearing these stories. And so when I think of Lut and his wife, the idea someone mentioned, I think it was the rabbi, that she became a salt. I remember hearing when I was growing up, Lut's wife looked back and she became a stone. So like she became, that's how she kind of become, like she became a statue that's fixed in somewhere. So that's something I didn't see in the Quran, but that's how I remember listening to that. And if you think of, even I read with my friends the Bible, and I think the only thing that was happening in that city was not only what we just discussed, but it's a city that there's high corruption, city where people were stealing things, so many bad things were happening. So I grew up that this story of Lut is a time when he was saved from all these things that's happening. It was not only one thing, but it was so many things that's happening. And so he tried his best as a prophet, he couldn't save his wife. So the idea was, you can be married to a prophet, or you can do whatever you want, but you have to be obedient, and no one can save you but yourself. So that's how I remember, like, you have to be, like my grandmother would say to me, well, I cannot save you, you just have to save yourself, you have to be obedient to God. And I think it shows what Lut, I'm not sure, in a way, I'm not a scholar, wouldn't want his wife to end up like this, but he himself could not save. Mm. So that's what the story I used to hear.
Yeah, thank you.
I feel like, I'll start with my introduction.
Yeah, you got to introduce yourself.
Just going to start responding. My name is Lisa Adams. I am a co-host of this podcast, and I co-lead 40 Orchards with Steph. And I spend half my time working with folks who are justice impacted, justice involved. And my hope is that I bring the wisdom from folks who are currently incarcerated out into our spaces where we are not. I think the story, it is a story. It is something that I heard. I'm fascinated with the things we share with our children, because I think about like learning the story when I was young, and I'm like, holy buckets, that's a story. I don't even know how you process the whole thing. And so like, really, the memory is the picture of what my imagination created of a woman turning into a salt pillar. Mm-hmm. And I think it had a little bit more energy of, I don't know, it's obedience, but it's also about like not looking back, like not reflecting back on it. And you're not, like there is something about like saving your job is to take care of yourself, not all the other people doing the things that they're not supposed to be doing. Wasn't a very complex teaching, but it was kind of quick. But like it centered on this woman being turned into, in my imagination, it was salt, but it was also stone. Mm-hmm. Kind of a combination of Miriam. Mm-hmm. Like in my head, that's what it was.
Yes.
It's
So I'm Stephanie. I co-lead with Lisa, and she and I both also used to be, I don't think we've said this on any of the episodes so far, but we also used to be in traditional ministry settings in churches and now exist in this organization outside of official church settings, but working alongside of many churches as well. But growing up in my particular segment of Christianity that I grew up in, I don't remember hearing much of this story besides hearing the story as a whole. So I think the character of Lot's wife was a pretty small character, but I definitely knew the story of Sodom and Gomorrah as a whole. And again, I would just echo the sort of like we should consider which stories from the text we do and don't share with children until they're ready, because there's a lot in this that is fraught and complicated to share with young ears. And I think then of actually how the narrative as a whole has expanded for me as I have aged. And I'm curious about how that might be true of any of us as a place to begin the conversation is as we think about Lot's wife, but also the narrative as a whole, what would we want to then add to this conversation from the knowledge we have now about how we interpret a story like Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot's wife's role in what takes place there. So how would you want listeners to kind of expand from how you would see this story today?
That's interesting.
One of the things that I think about is this idea of looking back. And that's what sort of sparked my interest in her besides noticing her in the Quran. But I heard a poem by, I believe her name is Naomi Diaz, called Of Course She Looked Back. I think it was on a podcast. And so it was about Lot's wife. And she was talking about, of course, she would look back when she's fleeing this place that she had lived in and potentially has left behind other children, has certainly left behind the men who were engaged to her daughters, neighbors, her home, anything that she had possessed, other children and people who are in this town that have been suffering because of all these negative things that have been happening around them, like Mariam mentioned. And so the poem reference, of course she looked back. So for me, that was something that I had never thought about before. I had kind of had this idea of she was just a defiant, disobedient woman. So of course she looked back in disobedience, but that shifted it to be this kind of grieving look of what was being lost and left and destroyed. And that launched me into more exploration into her story. And so that's, I think, what starts it for me, is the different kind of motivation of why she would look back.
Any other expansions that have happened for anyone who's here?
I think for me, I mean, it says the way I grew up, Noah's wife also did the same thing. I mean, she did not go into the ark. So the two women who disobeyed God, and they were married to two prophets who were revered, and God talked to them and sent them angels. So one thing that struck me as I grow up is that how much that they have time, or her husband had time to help her understand the consequences, and how much did he knew quickly. So it's like everything was happening so fast. And so that kind of interests me to know what is the impact if that will have happened, not that time, but another time, and people had more knowledge than they had at the time. So that really kind of challenges me to not question what the books are saying, but also get curious about it and say, given the time things were happening, you hear the story of Abraham who was chosen, but his father refused him, as he will go and talk to him every day to be a follower of God, like to not worship. And that states, I think, I don't know in the Bible, but it states in the Quran. I don't see that in this story. And so it's a short story. It's a short, as you said, it's a short period, short statements about this woman. And so that kind of challenged me to see, did she ever have an opportunity to know what was coming?
Mm-hmm. Rabbi Tamar, are there things in the Midrash about Lot's wife that would expand how we see her?
Yeah, so this all occurs after these strangers have come to the town to warn Lot and his wife about and his family about what's gonna happen, and save them. And when they arrive in the town, Lot is like near the gate and sees them and welcomes them into his home and feeds them, right? And you can't help but hear about that and think, when you hear about that, to think about Abraham and Sarah when they have strangers, possibly angels, come messengers come visit them to tell them that Isaac will be born, right? And again, there's the washing of the feet and the feeding and a similar kind of hospitality, right? So the Midrash says, now in that case, Sarah, went and baked bread for them, and Abraham went and made food for them. The Midrash interprets this story a little differently, that Lot's wife didn't want to be hospitable to them, that Lot wanted to bring them in, but she said, like, it's one thing to let them sleep here, it's another thing, like, now you want me to pamper them as well. And so he had said in the Midrash, he said to her, bring them a little salt, like, for their food. And she was like, oh, you want me to pamper them as well? And so the Midrash imagines that she's turned into a pillar of salt because she doesn't want to go to be hospitable and give them salt.
Interesting.
It's good to know.
I think of I just want to name the expansion, and that much of this I think would be a conversation for another podcast, but that it seems worth mentioning that I've had a different wrestling for understanding of what's happening in Sodom and Gomorrah, particularly through some things that, like, the prophet Ezekiel says about it. It seems to point to an oppression that is happening in the town, and that is beyond how it was read to me as when I was younger, of what the sin of Sodom was. And so I just want to name that there's a conversation to be had about what was bad about this place and what was so bad that it caused this violence, that I think is a conversation that takes a while to unpack, but has a lot of possibilities to think about what was so bad there, that affects how I see everybody in the narrative in different ways from how I grew up hearing about this place.
I had never really heard that the idea that there were people being oppressed there. So to piggyback on what you said, Steph, in the earlier verses or chapters in Genesis, Abraham is having a conversation with God. And God has said, the outcry has come up to me from Sodom and Gomorrah. The outcry is very great. And again, I had never thought about, if there's an outcry, there is a person who is crying out. There's a reason that this outcry is happening. It's not just like the people are crying out, hey, God, we're doing bad things down here. Come destroy us. But people to whom harmful things were being done were crying out. And so that also just expanded in my mind all the different people who were in the town, and what they were experiencing that was oppressive.
One thing I want to say is, and all of you are so knowledgeable, and you are in this field, I'm not. And so, but what strikes me is really the similarity of between the books that God brought up. So I'm so struck by that similarity of all the things that everyone is saying is something I've heard as a Muslim, or I grew up hearing it. And so I did not know, and I'm enjoying listening to it, honestly.
I think that's something we're finding in many of the episodes, that there's more overlap than we knew. And sometimes the stories are very different, but there is a lot of overlap about what is happening and this sort of sense of what God is doing. Lisa, you were so excited to say something earlier. You almost didn't introduce yourselves, and I want to go back to that.
I mean, I don't even know what that was about. That's probably past. I have to do things I get excited about. But I was thinking, so what I know is true is, if we pulled in, like, my pastor from my youth, or even that church, the current pastor, if we invited that person to come in and have a conversation, we would be talking about homosexuality as the entire point of the narrative. And so, like, I want to acknowledge that is a part of the tradition, and that is within Christianity, that is within the spectrum. I don't hold it that way any longer. I don't see that. That's not the focus. I do rely on Ezekiel explaining that, like the sin is actually being arrogant, overfed, unconcerned, and that you're not taking care of other people. And so, like, I think there's like there is something happening in there. And, like, to go back to, as Rachel was alluding to, like the conversation with Abraham of, like, one person, give me one. Well, 10. Are there 10 righteous people? Like, is there anybody there that is doing good? And that, like, when I imagine that, if I sit in that for a moment, and if I think about, like, spaces where there is just no one doing good, where everybody is harmed, where nobody is being taken care of, then it makes, for me, then it expands, like, the conversation and imagination about what's happening, versus it feels really, really narrow to say, well, this is what's happening. That's it. And, but, like, that's how it was taught. And I know that's how it's still being presented. And so I don't want to gloss over that, while also acknowledging that's not what I believe. And again, in the same, like, Christian big spectrum, I'm falling way towards a different side of things than what I was raised in.
Yeah. I have a question for the group, if that's okay.
Yeah.
In your interpretation, I'm trying to think if I should ask, like, in your religious tradition's interpretation or your own interpretation, so pick one. But is the moment when Lot offers his daughters instead, is that considered laudable, or is that also considered problematic?
Ooh, that is a great question. I would name, I think that's a rather overlooked part of the narrative. That's my first response, where it's not evaluated in either direction with the same rigor as another part of the story. Is like, I didn't grow up with that being any part of the conversation. And even as an adult, I don't know that that was really a part of the conversation in the way you'd expect, because that's a significant moment. In my interpretation, then, I would say it is fraught. It feels like to me, it feels like a way of feigning a false righteousness of sorts, because it's sort of trying to do it. It reminds me of in the prophets when the people are called out for sacrificing, and God is saying, don't give me your sacrifices. Treat the orphan and widow well, like do the things I've asked you to do. It feels something like that, like it's missing a bigger picture of what needs to be done at the time, and I would then interpret that as a fraught action, missing a bigger picture of what's happening.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to phrase it. I think I have never thought it laudable personally at all. And at the same time, there's some way in which my tradition, just my personal tradition, would kind of say, well, he was trying to protect these divine beings from something terrible. And so, it's just a couple of daughters versus the divine angels. So which one are we going to protect and protect? So it wasn't like it was lauded, but it also wasn't overtly condemned. It was like, well, he's probably not being a great dad right here. Maybe he could have come up with a different solution.
I wish that our listeners could see the look on Rabbi Tamar's face when you just said, well, he's not being a great dad. Her eyebrows went
I don't.
To say the least.
Yeah. Do you have more you want to say, Rachel? Okay. Well, I was thinking it's I don't feel like Lot was ever presented as anything laudable. Even the fact that Lot is saved isn't really because Lot is such a great human. It's kind of like Lot gets lucky. Like, because we've
He's
seen that in
related
the
to
Bible.
Abraham. He's
Yeah,
related to Abraham.
like that. Like, it's just like you're going to get an opportunity to try to get, but nobody feel even as you asked that question, I was like, oh, I feel like actually, I think because the story, it is a horrific story. And if you have any type of history of any type of abuse, these are the stories that like really are quite triggering and quite disorienting. And so I think when I would hear it, I would, in some ways, it just would turn into like, well, the daughters clearly were doing bad things too. Like everybody was bad. They were bad too. So like, it didn't matter what was happening. It was all bad. It's kind of how like, that's the only way I could like make sense of the thing. Yeah. And now it's a horrific trauma. And I think it's important to name that the text contains those things that can make it really difficult to even have a conversation about a story.
Miriam, was that section, is that in the Quran, that section of the story where Lot is offering his daughters to the town?
Yes, it's in the Quran. It's so, is it in the Bible?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I think everything is the same in terms, I read the Bible too, so they're exactly almost the same. What's so interesting to me, the question that the rabbi asked is something I never thought of anyone asking, but in this world we live in where, if you think of those times, maybe, women were not those elevated, except it shows that how God actually spoke to some of them, like Jesus' mother, or, kind of talked to them. It took, it was a testament how women were not valued as much as men at the time, I think, and in the history of the world. And so to really kind of think of it, that's how I think of it, and maybe they were not valued. That's why he was offering them. Maybe if the situation was different and he had 3 boys, maybe that wouldn't have happened. So you see what I'm saying? And so, and maybe that's coming from my culture as a Muslim, where women were oppressed for so long, and in many ways, even though the Quran doesn't say it, but the culture oppressed women. Maybe that's what my thinking is coming from. But it's a fascinating question, and it's in the Quran. But I think it's a question I have never seen anyone raising it. But it's a good question.
So part of the reason sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, part of the reason I asked the question is that, I think from the plain reading of the text, it does seem like Lot believes that it's better, at least, for him to offer his daughters than to let these guests who are in his home be harmed.
Yes.
Yeah. But certainly, like in our tradition, there's a lot of critique of Lot and this action. And, the Ramban, Nachmanides, who's a well-known medieval commentator, could I just read a little of it? I mean, he's
sure.
Really harsh. He says, from the praise of this man Lot, we have come to his disgrace. He made every effort on behalf of his guests in order to save them because they came under the shadow of his roof. But he is ready to appease the men of the city by abandoning his daughters to prostitution. This bespeaks nothing but an evil heart, for it shows that the matter of prostitution of women was not repugnant to him, and that in his opinion he would not be doing such great injustice to his daughters. It is for this reason that our rabbis have said, it is the custom of the world that a man fights to the death for the honor of his daughters and his wife, to slay or to be slain, but this man hands over his daughters to dishonor.
It makes me think, as you read that, about it makes me a little bit mad at Jesus, if I can be honest, as critiquing Lot's wife as compared to critiquing Lot. Because as you're naming, if we are critiquing him and saying, what has he missed? How is he thinking this is the right move to put his daughters there? That seems like an important critique to offer, and to say, even then for Lot's wife, like, what would we expect of a woman who was married to a man like that too? And so even Lot having some role to play in whatever missteps his wife takes in that sort of culture if he is this type of man.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that I also have really wrestled with Jesus's words about Lot's wife, remember Lot's wife, and how it's interpreted, because it's often interpreted as in the end of days, Jesus will come back and rescue, like pull out some people, those who believe, and leave behind those who don't. And so and then he says, you shouldn't go back to the field. You shouldn't look back. Remember Lot's wife. And I feel like this is just Rachel midrashing, but maybe there's stuff written about it. But when the idea of salt, I guess, throughout scripture is it takes place in covenants. Also, there's a covenant of salt. Jesus says in Matthew 5, we are the salt of the earth. There's something kind of richly good about salt in some way, and binding and communal. There's ways of sharing meals that have to do with salt. So when I think about her being turned into salt, what else is salt? It's like the salty tears of grief and lament. And so I have wondered I loved what you said in the very beginning, Rabbi Tamara, that this is obviously a metaphor for her being turned into salt. I had been taught that this was literal, but I do lean more towards the metaphor now. But I wonder if her looking back was her saying, this is so terrible. What has happened here before was so terrible. What is happening right now in the destruction of this place is so terrible. But I'm going to be the salt of the earth. I'm going to look back and I'm going to choose solidarity with the suffering and the poor. And there was a consequence. She was destroyed for it. She turned into salt, like somehow so consumed by the grief that's happening, by her lament and the horror of what's going on, that her body just becomes, for me, a symbol of lament, of all that's wrong, but also a pillar, like a standing with the oppressed, to say, even now today, I mean, Lisa, you can maybe speak to this in incarceration, but standing with people who are oppressed comes at a cost. Or if we choose to identify with, immigrants or whatever issue politically is happening that we choose to stand up for, it often comes with a cost. And so I look at her destruction as it's not a great thing that happened, but none of this is great. The whole thing is just a big disaster. Mm-hmm. But I have come to interpret her as a pillar of remembrance and lament. And so then, jumping forward to Jesus, this is a long comment, but in response to what Steph said about, I no longer think that Jesus is critiquing Lot's wife. I think that Jesus is saying, when people are divided and one is kind of elevated or saved versus another, and one is left behind and suffering, remember Lot's wife. Remember that there's a cost to standing with people, because then he says, whoever tries to preserve their life, like salt is a preservative, will lose it, and whoever loses their life will preserve it. And she chose, I think, to lose her life to preserve a call of what is wrong about injustice. So I think Jesus is saying, stand with the oppressed. Take a stand on injustice and bear the cost.
Wow. I'm curious of what we think about Rachel's elevation of Lot's wife as we hear that from other vantage points.
You guys, it seems to me that you are ahead of me in many ways, because Rachel is my friend and she called me, and I love God and I love to read different, books, including the Quran. But one of the things I was raised is you don't question God's words. Mm-hmm. And God's words are the words they are, and they're mystery, and you cannot disagree with it. That's how I was raised. And so it's fascinating that we're discussing this, and I think what Rachel is saying makes sense to me as an individual, as a human being. I don't know what the divine God said about this that's written in all the books. For me, it's a luxury that we're discussing it, but I don't know. Do I disbelieve it then? That's the struggle. I'm struggling with that.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if this is helpful, Mariam, but I sometimes notice that the text doesn't really tell us. The text is plain a lot of the time. In terms, it's descriptive. It describes things that happen, but it doesn't really tell us how we're meant to interpret them.
Yes.
And similarly, I think this is a good example of that. She turns back, she's turned to a pillar of salt. But what that means, it's hard to say, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at least in my tradition, there's a lot of different interpretations of what it means. When I was taught the story originally, even when I was young, I was taught, well, what do you think it meant that she looked back? Did she look back longingly? Did she look back remorsefully? Did she look back? Like, what exactly does it mean? And one of the commentaries says, well, the word, I think it's achor. I'm not looking at it right this second, but means she was looking behind Lot's back, which means she was kind of like going against him. She was sort of, not with him in the idea of leaving. He himself had a hard time leaving, but they both did leave. I don't know. I just think there's a lot of different ways to interpret this moment. What does it mean that she looked back, and what does it mean that she turns to a pillar of salt? Is it necessarily a punishment, or might it be something else, like what Rachel is saying? Maybe it's meant to teach us another kind of a lesson.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good example of when we're reading, we are interpreting the intent of a character, and that's a thing that the text often doesn't tell us. So this is saying a very similar thing in different words, I think, than you just did, Rabbi Tamara. But without knowing why she's looking back, that affects how we interpret the consequence of her looking back, and how often that happens, and we don't even realize it's happening. We read an action and we assume an intent that's not necessarily written. And the interpretation becomes really different according to the person's intent and what God is doing in response to that intent. And that does make stories difficult, but also makes for a really good discussion about all of those possibilities when there's multiple possibilities. And this is a great example, as she turned into the salt as a solidarity and a grief of tears and with the oppressed, or she turned into a pillar of salt because of her lack of hospitality and because she wasn't offering salt to the visitors, or something else entirely. And how does it affect how we live? What's the application according to those different interpretive possibilities?
Hearing me use the word, it's a luxury to talk about these things and ask these questions. And that word really resonates with me. It does feel like some of these conversations have been just rich and abundant, but it is a luxury to be able to ask these kinds of questions. And I am living up that luxury. I really enjoy it.
That's true. I completely like it. And if you think of the whole story, I don't know if the Bible says or the Old Testament says that she was not one of them, which means she was a straight woman. So that tells me then her desire of looking back was not to go back because she had a lover, or you see what I'm saying? So she really, I kind of think of the idea of feeling sorry for them or trying to be a mother like us today, where you live a whole place you lived for so many years, and women, we tend to make sure that everything that stays in that house, if you're moving, did I forget something, I go back. And so looking back, it's fascinating how we're discussing it. I'm liking it.
It makes me think of another, as you just said that, Mariam, I'm thinking about looking back, wondering if you unplugged the toaster before you left on vacation, and what is the ancient version of that? Like, or is there some sort of like, wait, did I take care of this, and that?
That's what we do as mothers.
Yeah. One thing I also love thinking about this, and Miriam, with the Somali connection too, is so many of my Somali friends have had to flee from violence, and they have had to leave behind homes and family members, and wondering, what was that like? What did they remember? What did they think about? And we also had on a very minor scale by comparison, because I'm an American, obviously, and things were different, but we did have to flee for our lives from Somaliland. And I remember very clearly what I left. I left damp laundry on the line. I left bananas on the counter, and I've often thought how rotten those must have gotten before someone came in and cleaned the house. I left the meal we had planned for that day, and I can picture everything where it was when we left. And so I feel like her story in that way, when I think about it in terms of grief, it helps me think with compassion on what some of my friends have experienced, and what that loss maybe felt like as they.
Yeah, and I can give you an example of my sister who, when they were fleeing, she had so much gold that she kept, and so they told her not to go back. She went back and she was killed before she picked up her gold in the place. And my rest of my family did not go back. So this is real. I mean, so it relates to what happens if you look back, or what happens if you go back in a situation that you are fleeing from. Yes.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Rabbi Tamar, you looked like you wanted to say something there. It makes me consider, first of all, the real life implications of this. That's what's coming up. People across time and history have had to flee places of violence. And what is it to have that story represented here in the text? And how do we interpret that? How do we find a place of solidarity or love? It also then makes me compare it in the biblical narrative to the fleeing of Egypt in Exodus, and the need to go. When you just described how fast you left, Rachel, that made me think of the way they are told to flee quickly, and the sort of different stories of fleeing that happen. You know, that have your shoes on your feet because you're going to leave tomorrow. Is a different version of fleeing, and how there's different sort of points to overlap and to wonder about and interpret in these stories of needing to flee for safety and freedom, and all of the different dynamics that are a part of people's stories when they have to flee a place for safety and freedom.
That's true.
So what then do we do with a story like hers, where we can't have this feels, I mean, the conversations are never really wrapped up. We transition to this point of having a takeaway, but this feels particularly like, what do we do with her narrative? Like, before I actually ask the takeaway question, I kind of want to ask, like, there's still a wrestle or a struggle or an emotional energy to this conversation that feels very unresolved. And I'm curious what we do with that spot when we have to end a conversation in that spot. What do we do with an unresolved character and narrative and frustration?
It's always unresolved.
Teach us more, Rabbi Tamar. How do we walk with the unresolved?
Do we ever feel like, oh, okay, I have I mean, I don't know. I'm taught not to have the answer, but to have the questions. So it's always unresolved.
I think your comfort with that is another point of holy envy that I think I've seen over time, of like, oh, there is this way. I think that in the Christian tradition, I was taught to look for resolution as much and as fast as possible. And there's a very different energy when you're looking for questions instead of answers that can be in a conversation like this and say, oh, it's okay that we don't know or feel struggle.
I think what I came up with is not to judge. Like, you know, what I was taught and what I read and what I'm hearing, kind of thinks it evolves. It begs the question for each one of us and say, well, maybe I shouldn't have judged that she looked back and she was punished and she go to hell. You know, that's how I grew up hearing. Oh, she will go to hell because that's what happened and she didn't listen. And so I feel today, listening to all this and asking questions, that I shouldn't judge her at all. And as the rabbi said, it's a question. Still, there is no answer. But at least I can feel it in my heart to change. There is a change in me. And I feel like I shouldn't judge her at all. I kind of explore more and see different ways, learn more, but not to judge.
Miriam, I think that transitions well into something that could be we usually close with some level of takeaway where we're saying this is what we want to remember or think about or do from the conversation, just to narrow it down a little bit. But what you just said makes me think maybe a helpful takeaway, a way of thinking about this today would be, what is a hope we would have for how the listeners, what they would add to their interpretive lens towards this narrative? What do we hope they would expand their questions into or their curiosity into as they encounter the narrative of Lot's wife and Sodom and Gomorrah? What would we hope, how might we hope our listeners think about this, or what more they would expose themselves to about this, or how they would use this in their life? Nice, easy question.
Well, I think about encouraging people, because this is where I have been learning so much and still learning how to do it, to look for who is missing. What voices are not on the page, or what voices are there that we've ignored, like Lot's daughters, who I have not thought about. Actually, as much study as I've done on her story, I have not thought about the daughters. And so that's a tool that I've been trying to grasp my mind around, is what is not there, whether it's a person or we talked recently about a scent that might not be on the page. Or a sound. How can I expand my imagination, which then might help me understand it in a new way? Mm-hmm. And a real practical takeaway that my husband thinks this is ridiculous, but I get a kick out of it. Instead of saying pass the salt, I say pass the Lot's wife. And so just kind of, because I want to remember her, because Jesus said, remember Lot's wife. And so that's my ongoing takeaway, is to remember Lot's wife by requesting when we eat to pass the Lot's wife, and then reflect on all that might mean.
Okay.
I hope someday to be as much of a Bible nerd as Rachel is. I aspire towards this, and I want to meet you in person. I think just like question everyone and everything in the text. Like, let's not be quick to assume there's a particular message we're meant to get from the story.
Yeah, I think people who will listen this, that's what they will get. They will get different opinions, but it all points out that points towards the kind of questioning and learning more and seeking, and not necessarily a quick answer, but challenging ourselves to know more. And when you know one thing, it leads you to another thing, and so being curious.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm just going to offer a permission slip for those who have been harmed by this particular text, or if this the story has a lot of painful pieces to it. And so I just want to give full permission to opt out. Like, I think there are times where stories are for us, and there's time when there's particular things in the text that might help us expand or help us learn how to do something. And I think other times it's just not for us at this time. Mm-hmm. And so, like the option to just say, I'm not interested, I'm going to opt out. And when you are, to have a safe room of folks, of people who love you and can see you and can walk with you through the passage, if that's what you desire to do.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
I'm thinking about just the challenge to look on our shelves, whether they're virtual shelves or physical bookshelves, for where we are looking to expand our idea of things. Because I think, like, the idea of these rabbis bringing up Lot's daughters and helping us see what's happening there, and these rabbis bringing up that she wasn't offering the salt, and that's why she's turned into salt. Those are things that wouldn't have been on my shelf. And in hearing them, they expand how I see a passage. And sometimes I think I'm reading a lot, but I'm not actually reading in a breadth across traditions or across time, in ways that can help me see more than the things on my shelf are showing me. And so I think I would like to challenge people to really consider who they're reading and who they could be reading as a way of expanding how they see and the kinds of questions they ask. So thank you for another conversation on Searching the Sacred. It always feels like there is a much longer conversation that could be had, and that feels also like a right way to end an episode, to say there is more, and we will end it here for today. So thank you so much for listening, And we look forward to hearing again from you next time.
This has been a 40 Orchards podcast. At 40 Orchards, our mission is to create circles for all people to wrestle through biblical texts so that together we can expand each other's experience of what is sacred, whole, and good. We search through the lens of sacred possibility, assuming there is more to be discovered, questioned, and applied as we listen for how God is still speaking. You can learn more about 40 Orchards and sign up for a study by going to 40, that's 40orchards.org. Our opening music is by Les FM. Our closing music is by NCR Music Vibes. Additional music is by 3 Music. Any references to books or other sources can be found in the show notes of this episode. Thank you for searching the sacred.